The ongoing debate over transgender athletes' participation in women's sports has reached a boiling point, with Senator Tommy Tuberville, R. launching a scathing attack on Maine Gov's JanetMills for her refusal to comply with former President Donald Trump's executive order banning transgender athletes from competing in girls' sports. During a recent interview on Outkicks, Don't Me with Dan Darkich, Tuberville did not mince words, calling Mills a total E for her defiance of Trump's directive and her staunch support for transgender inclusion in sports. This heated exchange is just one chapter in a broader national controversy that has pitted state governments against federal mandates, sparked legal battles, and ignited fierce debates over fairness, equality, and the future of women's sports. Background: Trump's executive order and Maine's defiance. The controversy began on February 5th, when former President Donald Trump signed an executive order titled No Men in Women's Sports, which aimed to bar transgender athletes from competing in women's and girls' sports at the federal level. The order argued that allowing transgender women, individuals assigned male at birth who identify as female, to compete in women's sports would undermine the integrity of female athletics and create an unfair competitive advantage. Trump's administration framed the order as a necessary measure to protect the rights of female athletes and ensure a level playing field. However, the order faced immediate pushback from several states, including Maine, which has been a vocal advocate for transgender rights. Governor Janet Mills, a Democrat, publicly refused to comply with the executive order, arguing that it violated both state and federal anti-discrimination laws. Maine has long been a progressive stronghold on LGBTQ+ issues, and Mills's administration has consistently supported policies that promote inclusivity and equality for transgender individuals. The clash between Trump and Mills escalated last week. During a gathering of governors in Washington, D.C. Trump reportedly confronted Mills, demanding to know why she was refusing to comply with his executive order. Mills responded by asserting that her state was adhering to both state and federal laws, prompting Trump to retort, "Well, we are the federal law." The exchange grew increasingly tense, with Trump threatening to cut federal funding to Maine if the state continued to defy his order. Mills's office later issued a statement vowing to take legal action against the Trump administration if it followed through on the funding threat. Tuberville's criticism, a total A, and the fight for common sense. Senator Tommy Tuberville, a former college football coach and staunch Trump ally, has emerged as one of the most vocal critics of Gov. Mills's stance on transgender athletes. During his appearance on Outkicks, Don't Me with Dan Darkich, Tuberville lambasted Mills for what he described as her egotistical defiance of Trump's order, with that governor of Maine just being a total A, to be honest with you, to the President of the United States, when he's already said, "This is not going to happen," and she said, "Well, I'll take you to court," and he said, "Well, I'll see you in court because I happen to run the federal government." Tuberville argued that Mills's refusal to comply with Trump's order was not only disrespectful, but also defied common sense. It just shows you how egotistical these people are, and it's just common sense that you don't do this, he said. The senator's comments reflect a broader conservative perspective that views the inclusion of transgender women in female sports as inherently unfair and detrimental to the integrity of women's athletics. Tuberville's criticism comes amid a wave of national scrutiny directed at Maine for its policies on transgender athletes. The state has faced particular backlash following a recent incident involving a transgender pole vaulter who competed in a girls' high school track and field event. Critics argue that such instances highlight the need for stricter regulations to prevent transgender women from competing in women's sports. While supporters of transgender rights contend that these policies are essential for ensuring inclusivity and combating discrimination, the legal and political fallout. The standoff between Maine and the Trump administration has significant legal and political implications. Shortly after Trump's confrontation with Mills, the U.S. Department of Education announced that it would be investigating Maine for potential Title IX violations related to its policies on transgender athletes. Title IX is a federal law that prohibits sex-based discrimination in education programs and activities, including athletics. The Trump administration has argued that allowing transgender women to compete in women's sports violates Title IX by creating an uneven playing field for female in facing such scrutiny. California, Minnesota, and Massachusetts have also been targeted by the Department of Education for defying Trump's executive order. These states, all of which are led by Democratic governors, have refused to implement bans on transgender athletes, citing state laws that protect transgender rights. The investigations into these states mark a significant escalation in the federal government's efforts to enforce its stance on transgender participation in sports. Meanwhile, Sen Tuberville is taking the fight to Congress. He is co-sponsoring the Protection of Women and Girls in Sports Act, a bill that mirrors the provisions of Trump's executive order. The legislation, which has already passed in the House of Representatives, seeks to prohibit transgender women from competing in women's and girls' sports at the federal level. Tuberville has expressed hope that the bill will pass in the Senate and be signed into law, ensuring that the issue is addressed before the 2028 Olympics, which are set to take place in Los Angeles. The broader debate, fairness versus inclusion, the controversy over transgender athletes in women's sports, is part of a larger national debate that pits concerns about fairness and competitive integrity against the principles of inclusivity and equality. Supporters of bans on transgender athletes argue that biological differences between males and females, such as muscle mass and bone density, give transgender women an inherent advantage in sports. They contend that allowing transgender women to compete in women's events undermines the achievements of female athletes and could discourage girls from participating in sports. On the other hand, advocates for transgender rights argue that such bans are discriminatory and perpetuate harmful stereotypes about transgender individuals. They emphasize that transgender women are women and should be treated as such in all aspects of life, including sports. Many also point out that the number of transgender athletes is relatively small and that the impact of their participation on women's sports has been overstated. The debate has become increasingly polarized, with both sides accusing the other of acting in bad faith. Conservatives have framed the issue as a matter of protecting women's rights, while progressives have criticized bans on transgender athletes as an attack on the LGBTQ+ community. The controversy has also spilled over into the realm of popular culture, with celebrities, athletes, and activists weighing in on both sides of the debate. The road ahead, legal challenges, and the 2028 Olympics, as the legal and political battles over transgender athletes continue. The issue is likely to remain a flashpoint in the culture wars. The investigations into Maine and other states could set important precedents for how Title IX is interpreted and enforced in the context of transgender rights. Legal challenges to Trump's executive order and state-level bans on transgender athletes are also expected to make their way through the courts, potentially reaching the Supreme Court. Sen Tuberville has expressed particular concern about the implications of the debate for the 2028 Olympics. He worries that the inclusion of transgender athletes could create a nightmare scenario for the Games, with male athletes identifying as women to gain a competitive advantage. What worries me is the Olympics are coming up here in our country, in Los Angeles, in a few years, and we do not need this to turn this into a nightmare. Tuberville said, "It's got to be men versus men, women versus women." Trump has also weighed in on the issue, vowing to use the powers of the federal government to prevent transgender athletes from competing in the 2028 Olympics. He has instructed Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem to deny visa applications from men attempting to fraudulently enter the United States while identifying themselves as women athletes. This hardline stance reflects the Trump administration's broader commitment to rolling back protections for transgender individuals and enforcing traditional gender norms. Conclusion: a nation divided. The clash between Sen Tommy Tuberville and Gov JanetMills over transgender athletes is emblematic of the deep divisions that characterize American politics today. As the debate over fairness, inclusivity, and the future of women's sports continues to unfold, it is clear that there are no easy answers. Both sides are deeply entrenched in their positions, and the issue is likely to remain a source of controversy for years to come. The spotlight remains on Maine and its defiance of Trump's executive order. As the federal government ramps up its efforts to enforce the ban on transgender athletes, the state's refusal to comply could have far-reaching consequences for its residents and its standing in the national political landscape. Meanwhile, Senator Tuberville and his allies in Congress are determined to push forward with legislation that would enshrine Trump's vision for women's sports into law. Whether they succeed will depend on the outcome of the ongoing legal and political battles, and on the willingness of the American people to find common ground in a deeply polarized nation.